Hi, and welcome to Network Schools, a show dedicated to opening and changing people's minds about public education. In the last show, we did an overview that explained why we have school 180 days a year, why we divide schools into elementary, junior, and high school, why we use seat time as the basis for earning credits, and how this factory paradigm that we have in our heads is so deeply ingrained that we take it either as a given or we just can't imagine a different way of doing schools. In this show, I hope to illustrate how the factory school leads to the belief that testing is the best measure of school quality, and hope that you will begin to see that that's not the most effective way to measure quality, and that maybe there are some different measures that we could use going forward that would help us improve schools and enable us to use some sort of an individualized measure of school effectiveness as opposed to a group measure, which testing inevitably is. Let me begin by taking a look at the overarching factory paradigm. It works something like this. In the minds of many people, they think of students as the raw material, teachers, and the students enter this factory as raw material. The teachers then sort of work like assembly line workers, pouring information into the youngsters and trying to improve them as they progress through this factory that's organized by age cohorts into 12 different grade levels, well, 13 counting kindergarten. The curriculum guides that they use serve as the industry standards, and the tests are quality control. That is, the tests are used to determine how the students are doing on each of the intermediate steps as they go through. If the student finishes with a product that meets industry standards, they receive a diploma at the end. Now, I know that this is an oversimplification on one level, but on another level, I think you'll see as we go through this that that is precisely the model that is in people's minds when it comes to education. And if a school is a factory, improving the quality depends on engineering things. That is, you sort of have to fix elements of this model in order to ensure or to produce a better product at the end. So the students need to be ready to learn when they enter school. That is, we need good raw material to start with. And so one of the things that public schools have tried to struggle with over the past few years is how can we get better raw material? Secondly, the teachers need to make sure that the raw material is transformed in a way that meets the quality standards. That is, in order for us to make this raw material better, we need to have better teachers, and they have to figure out better ways of reaching to the kids. So we need to have better assembly line workers in our factory if we're going to turn out a better product at the end. And we also need to make sure that our curriculum guides are well written, that it's easier for the assembly line workers to use. Indeed, of late there has been this notion that teachers would be best served by having curriculum guides that are so well written that the teachers are asked to follow the script to a T. There are several charter schools that have set up and had some good results in terms of student performance as measured by standardized achievement tests by following and adhering to curriculum guides that are scripted right down to every word that the teacher would say. And finally, you need to have tests that determine if the students are on track to earn a diploma. That is, periodically you give tests to the youngsters to see that when they get to the end of the rainbow, so to speak, when they leave school, that they'll have a diploma that illustrates that they've mastered the material that's been presented to them and that they're ready to go on to college or ready to enter the workforce. In order to do this, in order to operate these schools efficiently like a factory, then they need to be standardized, they need to be segmented, and they need to have effective methods of sorting and selecting. Standardization means uniformity. That means that one size fits all. And if you think about the way schools are organized by age-based cohorts, implicit in the way that they're organized is the assumption that all students mature at the same rate, and that all students learn at the same rate, all students learn the same way, all students are motivated by the same incentives, and that schools are accountable for teaching only those skills that are measurable. So let me go through these one by one, and sort of blow holes in them if you haven't already seen what the holes are. First, the notion that all students mature at the same rate. Anyone who has raised more than one child under their roof knows that the youngsters that you've raised mature differently, whether they're the same gender or different genders. And certainly there are lots of anecdotes that can be told that illustrate the preposterousness of the notion that students mature at the same rate. I'm a sports fan, so I'm going to use a couple of sports analogies. One is that Michael Jordan, when he was in high school, didn't make the varsity. Didn't make the varsity team, in part because he was sort of a scrawny kid. But as he matured, he became Michael Jordan, the premier basketball player of all time. David Robinson, who was enrolled in the Naval Academy, was 6'5" when he enrolled in the Naval Academy. He had a growth spurt after he graduated from high school, became 6'11", became an NBA player, wouldn't have even been allowed into the Naval Academy had he been 6'11" when he enrolled. His late maturity was a great advantage to the Naval Academy, but it's another illustration of the difference in maturity rates. I would suggest that there are lots of youngsters who mature at different rates, and there are Michael Jordans in third grade who are probably identified as not being able to make the varsity, shall we say. But by the time they're in eighth grade, they're really ready for the NBA of academics. And because we group kids by age cohorts and students don't mature at the same rate intellectually any more than they mature at the same rate physically, we end up missing the boat on a lot of kids. I recently attended a lecture at Dartmouth done by Sal Khan of Khan Academy, and part of this lecture is on a YouTube video, TED video. Just put in your little Google box Khan, K-H-A-N, TED, and go to the TED Talk, and you'll see some sterling examples of differences in maturity rates that yield remarkable changes in the short term in terms of student achievement. The other thing that we assume as part of the way that our schools are organized for efficiency is that all students learn at the same rate. And they don't learn at the same rate. And that Khan video had an illustration of that as well. Because some students plod through some parts of a course but then catch fire, they will suddenly catch up with their classmates who are presumably ahead of them because they're smarter. The students don't learn at the same rate in all subject areas. And just as they mature at different rates, they learn at different rates. And we have too often, because time is fixed and learning is variable, come to the wrong conclusion about a lot of kids, namely the conclusion that they're slow learners, when actually they are just learning portions of the curriculum slowly and they can advance more quickly. And we've confused intelligence to mean with velocity of learning, as opposed to capacity for learning. A number of youngsters can learn volumes of information. They just don't learn it as fast at certain points of their lives, and sometimes maybe they just don't learn it as fast over time. We also believe, because one size fits all, and particularly in this example that I gave earlier of the scripted curriculum documents, that all students learn the same way. They don't learn the same way. In the last episode I was talking about this dualistic way of thinking where phonics and whole language in reading, there was this war that was raging, and the suggestion was that you needed to teach all the kids phonics because that's the way you learn how to read. You learn to read by phonics. I wish that were the case, because if it were the case, all of the kids in the United States would be reading at the same proficiency level. But it's not. That's why reading specialists and teachers have to intervene with a lot of kids, and when that intervention takes place and they figure out how it is that students learn differently, they can bring the kids up to the same rate over time. We also assume that all students are motivated by the same incentives, and I know that that's not the case. Speaking for myself, and I know that this is generalizing from the particular, I was never motivated to make the National Honor Society. I needed to make sure that I didn't get anything lower than a B, because that was what my father set as the expectation, and my mom. But in terms of making the National Honor Society, that wasn't something that I aspired to. And I think that I did have teachers who figured out what did motivate me, and in particular courses, and what did interest me. And I was motivated to learn things that I was interested in. And I think that that's not different from most kids. But for some reason, we assume that everybody wants to be a straight A student, or everybody wants to get into to college or whatever. That is implicit in the standardization that we have in schools, that grades are what motivates youngsters. And finally, if you think about how we hold schools accountable, particularly since No Child Left Behind, we're holding schools accountable now for those things that are measurable. We're only interested in whether students perform well on standardized achievement tests in reading and mathematics. And if you don't believe that that's the case, take a look at what's been happening to schools when the budget crisis has hit. Invariably, schools will not make cuts that will compromise their ability to score high on tests. And so, regretfully, some schools have been cutting back on art and music because those aren't measured. They're not used as a basis for determining whether a school is good or not. And so, in the factory paradigm, we've just said we're only interested in those things that we can measure. And that's what we're going to use as the basis for holding schools accountable. Everything else is unimportant. When you break these down, you can see how these standardized assumptions play out. All students mature at the same rate. That plays out in age-based grade levels. All students learn at the same rate. Students who learn more slowly are sometimes left back, or they're placed in a slow learners group. And if just the example that I just gave, in some cases you can be branded in third grade as a slow learner because at that particular point in your life you were not grabbing the material as quickly as you did later on. And so again, my personal experience in this is on both ends. When I was in 5th grade, I was identified as being gifted and talented. Why? Because I moved from Pennsylvania to Oklahoma, and the Pennsylvania schools were far ahead of the Oklahoma schools in terms of the content that had been presented to me. And so consequently, I looked like I was a genius when I was in their schools. When I moved back to Pennsylvania, though, the opposite occurred. I was the kid from Oklahoma all of a sudden, and they knew that the Oklahoma curriculum didn't begin to measure up to the Pennsylvania curriculum. So I was placed in a middle group. And so I've seen the differences in expectations that are applied to gifted students in middle school age as compared to those that are applied to mid-level students. And a lot of that is plays out at the, even with kids who stayed in the same place, raised in the same place, they're placed in a group labeled by teachers, and consequently they fall farther and farther behind. Another element of standardization is that it results in regulations, and whenever you have regulations, you have a bureaucracy. As instruction and assessment becomes more standardized, regulations are needed to ensure that all schools are, that those standards are being met. And middle managers are needed to determine if the schools are meeting those regulations, and the even-handed implementation of standards depends on a bureaucracy. So all of the accusations that schools have all of these mid-level managers and bureaucrats are accurate. That's because we have these regulations in place to make sure that we're meeting the standards. And one area in particular where regulations have really come into play, and I can attest to this because I was a school administrator from 1975 until 2012. And during that time interval, there was a law passed at the federal level that had to do with special education, a law that was much needed because there were youngsters who were being identified as who are now identified as special ed, who before were just sort of pushed right out the door in school. And so consequently they passed a host of laws and regulations and guidelines to make sure that schools were meeting the needs of all the kids. And roughly 12 to 15% of the students are affected by these regulations that have to do with making sure that they're receiving a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. Free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment has resulted in a ton of regulations, and consequently those regulations have resulted in the need to have people overseeing to make sure the regulations are being met, and a bureaucracy that at the state level and in some larger districts at the local level to make sure that there's an even-handed implementation of those standards. That's because, again, we think of the schools in this factory model where these youngsters are expected to progress at the same rate as their age cohorts in learning the same curriculum as their age cohorts. Also, we've had a lot of segmentation because we've divided education into component parts. All the students are divided into grade levels based on their age. But furthermore, schooling is divided into content areas. And the content areas are divided into units, and the units are divided into lessons. There's been a trend of late to try to inject interdisciplinary instruction to offset this kind of a thing at the school level, but that's being fought against because of the testing that's being done, where you need to make sure that you have reading being done in a way that you'll get higher reading scores on kneecaps if you're in New England, and you get the higher math scores. So the content area is, again, part of this notion of dividing school time up so that you can efficiently run things. And the labor then is divided based on grade levels and content areas. So you don't have a teacher of everything. You have a teacher of a particular grade level, or you have at the secondary level, a teacher of a particular content area, sometimes a particular content area at a particular grade level. And that's to make sure that the instruction is delivered efficiently in keeping with this notion that the school is a factory that's divided into little boxes and silos. One of the outcomes of teaching efficiently in one-size-fits-all is that you end up teaching to the middle, because that's the most efficient way to do it. If you've got 25 youngsters in your class and their abilities or rate of learning is spread over a continuum, the most efficient way to teach is to figure out where the midpoint is and teach to that midpoint. When you do that, when they're assigned, and the students are assigned by age and assumed to learn at the same rate, the range of student skill levels widens as the students get older. That makes teaching to the middle less efficient, because if the range in first grade is this, by the time you get to the 8th grade, the range might be this wide. The workaround to that is that you then divide the youngsters into smaller groups. The graphic that you see here now shows how you could take that big umbrella bell curve and break it into different smaller bell curves, and you would have an A group, a B group, a C group, a D group, and an E group. By breaking it into smaller groups, you narrow that bell curve, but you're still teaching to the midpoint. You're not teaching to each individual. When you homogeneously group kids, there's this belief that somehow or another you're no longer teaching to the midpoint. The fact of the matter is, anywhere along the bell curve, when you start dividing students into groups, the midpoint is still the midpoint. It's just that the extremes are less. When you try to figure out how to best and most efficiently and most fairly sort those kids into these different groups, standardized tests come to the forefront, because they're the easiest and the fairest way for sorting and selecting students. They've been the fairest and the most even-handed way since the 50s at least. I know schools that I attended as a youngster used California Achievement Test or Iowa Achievement Test, depending on which state I was living in, as the basis for determining who went into this group and who went into that group and who went into the next group. They would also use, to a lesser degree, teacher grades. They'd use the teacher grades to a lesser degree because there was a belief that the standardized tests were more objective. And so standardized tests were used because they're easy to administer, they're inexpensive to score, and they provide some means of comparing individual student performance to the performance of other students in a cohort. They're therefore, ideal when you're talking about efficiency. And when you use standardized achievement tests to sort students or to grade students or to grade schools, you're reinforcing assumptions about learning. You're reinforcing the assumption that all students mature at the same rate because they're given by grade level. You're reinforcing the assumption that all students learn at the same rate, age cohorts. You're reinforcing the notion that they learn the same way, because if you don't do well on the achievement test, well, usually you end up following some scripted curriculum to remediate your skill level. You're assuming that they're all motivated by the same incentives. Namely, they all want to do well on the test. That may or may not be the case, and some students who don't test well can end up getting penalized as a consequence of that. And it reinforces the notion that the schools are accountable for teaching only those skills that are measurable. I have to say that the No Child Left Behind legislation, which relies on standardized testing, reinforces all of these assumptions even more so. The grade level testing of academic subjects certainly does that. The fact that they learn at the same rate has resulted in this notion of high-stakes tests where if by the time you're in 8th grade you haven't learned this much information, well, you're going to be left behind, or you're going to be shunted off into a different track. And all students learning in the same way, you end up getting placed often into mandated reading programs, especially if you're in a failing school. As part of the No Child Left Behind, there were actually specific curricula that you were required to draw from at one point in time. And the No Child Left Behind legislation assumes that schools and teachers are accountable for teaching only those school skills that are measurable. Students aren't tested on anything that's difficult to measure. They're not tested on anything beyond pencil and paper assessments. So, and so that I'm clear to the viewers that this isn't a partisan political issue, I have to say that the race to the top is No Child Left Behind more so. There is no let-up, no matter which party is elected to the federal level, as on the emphasis of standardized achievement tests. There is the belief that these standardized achievement tests are the be-all and end-all in terms of defining whether a school is meeting quality. That, in my judgment, is not the case, and we'll be talking more about that later, because I think the important metric is how is each child doing in school, not just on things that are easily measured, but in a more holistic fashion. There is some evidence that we're moving away from this factory paradigm when it comes to measuring tests. We're finding homeschooling is increasing dramatically, and most parents who opt out of public education are doing so because they disagree with the standards set by the school. In some cases, it's because the moral standards aren't what the parents want, and so for that reason there's religious reasons that they're pulling out of school. But increasingly, and I have read, it's late April when I'm doing this broadcast, I've read several articles about parents who are opting out of the tests, and I can imagine that if the schools insist on using the tests as the basis, you're going to see many of those parents opting into homeschools so that they can provide something beyond reading and math to their youngsters, because I think parents are getting frustrated with the notion that the narrowing of the curriculum. You're also seeing a lot of non-traditional charter schools opening up that are based on individualized instruction as opposed to group instruction. And Witness Khan Academy, which had 41 million visitors over the past 18 months, self-paced online instruction, which is inherently individualized, is on the rise and on the increase, and provides a whole different way of delivering instruction. The obstacles to changing this factory paradigm, the link between standardization and efficiency seems to be like inseparable in people's minds. And up until the advent of YouTube and the advent of a lot of online freeware that's out there, the costs for individualization were much higher on a per pupil basis than the factory program. The efficiencies that the factory model provided couldn't be matched if you wanted to go into an individualized direction. That's not the case anymore. There's knowing what we know now about technology and knowing what we know now about child development, there's no reason for the continuation of the factory model. And also, I think that deregulation has sort of gotten a black eye in some cases in the private sector. Those of us who value the environment in particular can point to many issues of deregulation that arguably have undercut the public good. And So consequently, some of the people who are progressive in their thinking about things like the environment look at the advent and the burgeoning of this online learning and deregulation, and they say, ooh, I'm not sure that I want to go in that direction. And it's so different in terms of the way that you think about education that it becomes problematic for a whole lot of people. And so those are some of the obstacles to it. But the biggest obstacle to changing the factory paradigm is that we don't even see it. There are many people who either, as I mentioned before, we either don't see how the factory paradigm is driving us towards standardized achievement testing, or we make the assumption that this is the only way that schools can be organized. Schools don't have to be organized like factories. They can be organized like networks, and increasingly they're moving in that direction, whether we want to have that kind of a school or not. I think that's the kind of school we're going to have in the future. And in the next show, we'll go into more, I'll present my case for the fact that we're moving in that direction and present the case that it's a good thing.